Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include Dr. Ellie Leibowitz, neuropsychologist Dr. Lisa Novak, nutritionist Lara Field, and many more.
Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice.
This episode is brought to you by Coping Partners. Coping Partners is a mental health practice in the Chicago suburbs dedicated to helping children, adolescents, and adults. We help manage various challenges, including anxiety, divorce, behavioral issues, relationship problems, and much more. Check out episodes of our podcast and our website at copingpartners.com, and you can contact us with any questions you have. So before we dive into today's topic, I first wanted to thank the whole Catch organization for introducing me to Dr. Bolton, who's our guest for today. I was lucky enough to watch him present just a few weeks ago in Northbrook and thought it was such an important topic to bring to our audience today. Dr. Bolton is a clinical psychologist, author of the book Untethered, and a passionate advocate for students facing emotional and behavioral challenges. Since 1987, Dr. Bolton has dedicated his career to supporting vulnerable youth, first as a school psychologist in therapeutic schools, and later as the principal of North Shore Academy, a K-12 public therapeutic school near Chicago. He now consults with school leaders across the country, helping them build resilient, mentally healthy communities through keynote talks, workshops, and one-on-one coaching. His book, Untethered, weaves together decades of professional insight with his own personal journey through identity, burnout, and purpose. It's a powerful call to rethink how we support others and ourselves, and I'm thrilled to welcome him to the show. I had the pleasure of watching him speak in person just a few weeks ago through, again, this wonderful organization through Catch, which I hope you will also check out. And he spoke on a topic which I thought was really important, and I wanted him to continue to share his information with my audience as well. So today we will be addressing the pressures our kiddos feel in working toward getting into elite colleges, and we will debunk some commonly held myths. Okay, so thank you. That was a long introduction, but thank you, Dr. Bolton, for being here.
Lee, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and it was so nice to be a part of the Catch event as well a few weeks ago.
It was really nice. So listening to you speak most recently, it was apparent immediately that you were meant to help kids and that you've done that both one-on-one and also in your work as a principal. Can you share a little bit about how you got into this work?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing how our lives, when we look back at them, it looks like there's a path, but I really didn't see a path when I was graduating from college, and I can remember just happening to find a job working at a summer program for kids with emotional behavioral problems, and within 10 days of being there, I realized this is what I want to do with the rest of my life, and so I worked there. I worked in as a teaching assistant at therapeutic schools and realized that I really wanted to get my PhD. And so I got my PhD and did my internship at Children's Memorial Hospital, now Lurie's Hospital. And what I realized is the kids I really wanted to help the most, there's only so much you can do in a 15-minute therapy session. And I realized that there's no place quite as powerful as schools to make an impact on kids, especially who struggle socially and emotionally. But for all kids, we all respond to the communities we're a part of. And so then I started working in therapeutic schools, and I was lucky enough to be the principal at North Shore Academy and loved that work. And since then, I've been trying to help schools and parents and other organizations figure out how do we best support the kids, especially now as we continue to find ourselves in this children's mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's exactly what I was going to ask about is kind of what have you observed lately in terms of this mental health crisis that you and of course others are observing?
Yeah, being on the North Shore of Chicago, I think that I was really struck, and it made intuitive sense, but I was struck when I learned that kids in high achieving schools were named an at-risk group for depression, anxiety, substance use. And I think that we had always thought that being in these high-performing school districts with all of these resources was protective. But all of a sudden, it was named a risk factor along with things like poverty and discrimination and trauma. And so as we began to look at that, one of the things that I began to realize was the kinds of pressure that we're putting on our kids is there can be too much of a good thing at some level. There can be, and I think that so often in our efforts to support our kids' development, we do things that undermine their development. And so I began to focus more on that, understand it, read more and more research about this, and became clearer and clearer to me that that so much of what we're trying to do is undermining, not supporting their development.
Right, right. No, and I think there was some funny audience questions, about like, should we
Yeah.
move to a bad suburb where there's terrible schools? And I,
Yeah.
kind of chuckled thinking, it's a
Yeah.
good question, right?
Yeah.
But it's not that it's bad to have the resources and the supports in place, but what do you think it is specifically about, being in an affluent society, being in a good school district that causes, or is highly correlated with these negative outcomes?
Yeah, so I think that in many ways we've created these communities, these ideas of scarcity, and 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 also, and I think that we've cultivated this idea that there's one path
Mhm.
to get through, one really good path to get through childhood, and we cultivate that for our kids. And so, and I was a part of that. I've got two kids who um, they've just graduated from college in the last couple of years, but in the height of this, we began to curate their lives very early on, believing that achieving in school, achieving in sports, achieving in all of these different areas is what will get them to be happy and healthy and successful as adults. And so, for us, we started with baby Einstein. That's what, it was like 2001 and
Yeah,
everybody, so we've got to get their brains ready so we can get them into high achieving preschool.
yeah, and
And
baby
so then if we get
Mozart.
them into high achieving preschool, then they're going to do really well in elementary school, which allows them to get into the accelerated classes in middle school, which then allows them to take AP classes. And the more AP classes, the better,
Mm,
right? And that will allow them to get to into a highly selective school because we know highly selective schools are better for our kids.
mm,
And then we will launch them into a life that is happy and successful. And what I realized as I began to dive into the research is that all of this is just a house of cards, that none of the research supports any of these assumptions. And yet we put a ton of pressure on ourselves and our kids to create these opportunities for them. We call them opportunities, but in so many ways, they actually undermine their wellness.
yeah, yeah. No, it's so true. And you're right. It kind of like starts so early before I think parents are even aware of what's happening, partly because of how the community is almost set up, whether it's
Yes.
in sports or dance or this or that. They're really, they've got to kind of pick a path. And it's really hard to get out of that structure.
Yeah.
But it's true that kids end up feeling that pressure, even though parents, I don't think intentionally are fueling it. And you're right. I mean, on Instagram, there's these videos of college age kids, well, almost college age kids with these bed parties. And so
Yeah.
whatever college they get into, I mean, I think thousands of dollars are being spent on the gear, and you
Yeah.
see them like, woo, I got into whatever school. And I know that kids are exposed to that in middle school.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
they're already like thinking, oh, I have to get into a good college. Even though I think many adults would say, it's not going to matter. You're going to be fine. Like most careers, this is not going to make or break you. So you're telling us that, of course, high achievement, right? Being in an elite college is not actually what's going to make your kids healthy and happy adults.
Right.
Tell us more about how you know that.
Well, um, as I began to dive into the research, it really surprised me because I had been filled with these assumptions as well. So there's a number of researchers out there who've taken a look at things like um, how successful kids are following graduation from an elite college
Mhm.
versus a non-elite college. And one of the things they did, for instance, was they took a look at kids who got into the elite colleges, but were unable to go for one
Right.
reason or another and had to go to a local school, state school, whatever it may be for family circumstances. What they found is that there's no difference in earning 10 years after graduation. So this surprised me. There's other research that took a look at learning in particular, because I assume that if you go to a Harvard, you're going to learn more than if you go to Northwestern, you're going to learn more than you do at Northern. And what they found is that that's not true.
Wow.
That kids don't learn more in highly selective schools. What they did find is there's one thing that does impact how much kids learn, and it's how much they study. And so
Yeah.
that's the variable. It's not whether you go to an elite college that
Right.
that drives your learning. And Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about he talks about how in some ways if you go to Harvard, and you've always spent time in the top 5% of your class. There's a Harvard psychologist, Sean Aker, who in his freshman seminars, he will say, how does it feel for half of you now are in the lowest 50th percentile for the first time in your life? How does that feel? And there's more and more competition for, internships. There's more and more competition for being able to be assistant if you are a chemist. And what Malcolm Gladwell talks about is that, if you go to a state school, you're much likely to work with to get that internship. You're more likely to have a closer relationship with a professor who then helps you get into graduate school versus getting weeded out at Harvard. And then all of a sudden, I guess chemistry isn't for me. If I had gone to the University of Maryland or
Right.
you know, Southern Illinois,
Right.
I would have been I'd be going to graduate school in chemistry. And
It's fascinating.
yeah, and so as I began to look at that research, I realized that the thing we've got all these impressions that this is what's right and what's best for our kids, and that's not true. But there's also a way that in the that that society is gearing us more and more towards our feeling like we need this. So the U.S. News and World reports, who doesn't want to go to the best school in the country, right? And the metrics on that are not geared towards what is a good student experience, what is this experience that drives wellness. It's how
Right.
much money they put into the dorm rooms. It's how selective are you? And so all of a sudden selectivity becomes the measure. And creating this scarcity that everybody feels like they've got to work toward. So I need to,
Right.
if I don't get the ACT score I want, if I don't get into if I don't get fours and fives on my 5 or 6 AP classes,
Right.
then all of a sudden my future is doomed.
Right.
And so we begin, and as parents, we can fall into that too, by focusing so much on their achievement and their grades and everything else.
And what's interesting is, the part where you said how much you study actually does matter, which makes
Yeah,
sense, right? Like, of
yeah,
course, you could listen to a bazillion books on Audible, and you could actually teach yourself on YouTube, and you could
right.
you could go to college online. And the idea that actually matters, or getting real work experience will matter,
Yeah,
and make you more marketable, and make you, able to eventually figure out your career path, but not necessarily like the tier of school that you go to. Um,
yeah,
it's interesting because I feel like in the North Shore, especially, but all affluent, communities, you know, people are really starting early, getting private college counselors, really trying to figure out what can I do to stand out, for my
yeah,
child. And we try to say to kids, take relax, it's going to be fine wherever you go to school, it's going to be fine, but they don't believe us always.
yeah, yeah,
So this is very helpful just to say, no, there's actually real data that
yeah,
says that where you go to school is not, going to indicate your level of wealth, happiness, really much. Um,
yeah.
it sounds like post 10 years. So maybe short term, but not much after that.
Right, right. It's interesting. I had a family come in into my office, really worried about their daughter, who I think had always been kind of light and had an easygoing, and um, suddenly she was a junior, and I
Ugh.
think she was maybe first violin and captain of the lacrosse team, and what she was able to say is that all of a sudden the level of competition as you seek these selective places ends up interfering with the thing that really does lead to wellness, which is our relationships with other people, our ability to be, that if you take a look, it's our relational health, not how the college we went to, not how much money we make. It's the quality of our relationships. And so what she was saying is, all of a sudden I was competing against my best friends for these places on these, whether it be on the swim team or on the lacrosse team, or my place in the class on the class, in terms of
The
where I'm at
ranking.
in the class ranking.
Yeah.
And so, and she was miserable, and she started to shut down and and anxiety started to really paralyze her. And it's because we are focusing less on the things that lead to wellness and actually open our brains up for learning.
Right.
And the more we create this scarcity, the more we create communities of competition. And
Right.
competition can be good, but it can also become toxic if it takes away from the things that are most
Right.
important to us.
Right, absolutely. Well, like if you encourage someone in high school to study with a friend,
Yeah,
and
right.
some will, and it's much more enjoyable, and they're connected, and there's, the stress levels goes down. And like you said, others who are super, super cutthroat competitive are going to isolate on purpose so that they don't help the other
That's
student.
right.
And
That's right.
you can just see how that affects mental health too.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I also think about, how some kids are, their brains are kind of wired for success in high school. The way that the high schools are traditionally looking at student
yeah.
development, and others are maybe not quite as ready in that way in terms of their executive functioning skills. Um, can you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about how our school systems are designed, and how that's not a one size fit all for everyone?
I love the question. Thank you for asking that. Our schools are really built for compliance, and more than anything else, it's do we get to class on time? Do we have all of our materials? Can we sit still for 45 minutes and pay attention? Can we make smooth transitions to the next class? Can we do this for 6 hours a day for 180 days a year? Can we follow directions on assignments so that when we come home, will we get all of our work done? Um, and uh, um, and so there, to me, this is these are not indicators of what we need for a career. It's not an indicator of what we need. This level of our ability to comply is really a brain. Does it fit our brains, right? And if we've got a brain that thinks in these ways, logically and sequentially, and is able to plan, things go pretty well. Um, I've got I've got two kids with the same parents,
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't have looked more different in their growing up. And one, they talk about these skills as executive functioning skills. These skills that allow you to plan and organize, kind of like what an executive would do. I think that's how they coined the term. What an executive would do to run a company. Can our brains kind of adapt to things that allow us to? It's really about, does it allow us to be compliant with
Mm-hmm.
the expectations of a highly structured world? Um, I think that we see these skills as, I think we overplay the importance of these skills in life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because what you'll often find are people who are really good at organizing and planning often have a hard time being present in the moment,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm so worried about what's coming up and I can't talk to you. I can't sit down and have a relaxed dinner because I've got to get to all these different things I've got to do. And so it's important to be able to be compliant and follow through. And it's important also to be present and enjoy each moment. And unfortunately, our schools are really built towards the former
Mm-hmm.
and really punish kids when they struggle with the latter. And one of the things that I think is interesting is these skills are developmental. And so um, I think that our schools, number one, have increased what they talk about, the cognitive load
Mm-hmm.
on kids. So I think we're asking kids to do in eighth grade what I was being asked to do as a junior and senior in high school in terms of the kinds of time and organization I need to put into all of the homework, in terms of the elaborate projects. And this is all to push the envelope on rigor, right? But if my brain's not ready for that, that's what we know is that when stress comes from putting too much demands on people who don't have the skills yet.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk about not having the skills yet, I mean yet. And
Yeah,
so
yet being an important word.
exactly, my daughter, those skills came, I think she had her full prefrontal cortex and executive functioning skills were right, like she had them developed in the womb, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my son, it took longer. And
Mm-hmm.
and just like we take a look at kids and we can tell an eighth grader, you've got an eighth grader who's 6 foot tall and has facial hair growing or sprouting, right? And they're walking down the hall with another kid they've been friends with for years who's still 2 years away from puberty.
Right.
But what we would do is, the same thing is true in our brains. We just can't see it. We say, oh, the other the second one just hasn't hit their growth spurt yet.
Right.
But we don't see inside the brain, so we just assume when kids aren't organized in the way we want them to be, we think they're lazy. We think that they're unmotivated. We think that they're oppositional. We think that they're distracted. And so we begin to punish them for that.
Mm-hmm.
We'd never punish a kid for not growing facial hair,
Right.
right? But here we are, we're punishing kids for development, issues of development. And this is where I think it can get really tricky, because all of a sudden, then kids begin experiencing real shame.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really interfere with their sense of wellness. If they
Absolutely.
if they and then the anxiety that we have, that all of a sudden getting into an Ivy is better than getting into a state school, and that their sense of worth is based on their ability to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be making the travel team or making 3 travel teams, or whether it be getting a 5 on the AP class, or being in the top five fifth percentile of your SAT or ACT scores.
Absolutely.
That's putting a ton of pressure on kids. That number one, doesn't these things don't lead to great outcomes, and
Right.
the pressure itself undermines their ability to be resilient.
Right. So we've given some talks where we talk about process versus outcome,
Yeah,
and how parents can really, one thing that they can actually do is to really say, I loved the work you put into that project. I
yeah,
love and name what specifically you're noticing, as opposed to, focusing on the grade or focusing on the art project or the actual outcome.
Yeah.
And I think, like you're saying, both for kids who are struggling to meet these markers of achievement, the way that it's set up in the schools, and for the kids who are actually achieving the markers of achievement, both benefit from this idea of really just kind of naming, the hard work or what they've put into it rather than focusing on the outcome because of sort of perfectionistic or perfectionism and the negatives, the toxic outcomes. Tell us a little bit about the perfectionistic sort of hamster wheel that I think a lot of people get stuck on.
I again, I appreciate the sensitivity of the question, right? To be the 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 kids who struggle to keep up are at risk for feeling shamed, or kids who struggle to focus for 45 minutes, kids whose motor run quicker.
Right.
It's harder for them to sit in school and focus. But the opposite is also true, that when kids begin to see their worth based on what they achieve, and I think as parents, we'd be surprised at how often we send these messages. There's research where they asked kids, they asked parents, what's the message you want to send to your kids, whether you value achievement or kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And parents would say, 90% of parents said, I communicate to my kids that kindness is the most important thing. They asked their kids, and 86% of those kids, those parents, said that their parents valued achievement more
Mm-hmm.
than kindness. And we do this in all sorts of subtle ways. But what ends up happening is they talk about achievement addiction, that there becomes a real fear if my value is based on what I achieve. Then there can be real fear and anxiety about doing things where I might struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see kids limiting their worlds because, if I can't get an A on that, I don't want to take that class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they
Or
they
even not trying a new sport or an
not
activity.
trying a new sport, or feeling crushed if you don't become captain.
Mm.
Feeling crushed if you don't, we've as parents we put all of it. It's not just going out and playing Little League baseball. All of a sudden, you need to make the travel team. In order to make the travel team, you need to go to 6 a.m. hitting practice, and maybe 8 p.m. Pitching practice,
Mm.
right? And then the whole family's going to follow you to Davenport, Iowa,
All
and
summer.
Grand Rapids, Michigan, every weekend, because all of a sudden there are all these messages that we say your ability to do this is so important that we're not going to go on a family vacation this year, and your sister is going to have to come along with us to all of these activities.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of implicit ways that we say these things are important without realizing it. But here's the thing that happens is that achievement, as you continue to achieve, it becomes scarcer and scarcer. So all of a sudden it's, when you have straight A's and you've gotten great great scores on all of your AP tests, then you've got to get into a highly selective school. And then it's not good enough to get B's and C's in a highly selective school. You've got to get A's in that highly selective school.
Yeah.
And then you've got to get, then if you want to go to law school, you've got to get into the best law school. It just doesn't end. And so
Right.
what they talk about is this hedonic treadmill. And what happens is that we believe that getting the promotion, we believe that getting into the college is enough. But what happens is whenever we achieve something we really like, the new car smell wears off when we've got that new car we've always wanted. And all of a sudden there's a nicer car driving down the road. What happens is it gives us a brief, a bump in our happiness, but then all of a sudden it leaves us wanting more again. And we want an even nicer car. We need an even better promotion. We need to get a better salary. For kids, we need to get not just into the best law school, but then I've got to get the best clerkship. And then I've got to be in and it doesn't end. And falling short can be crushing.
Mm-hmm.
And so so this is how you see that the idea of the hedonic treadmill is you're working really hard, but you're not getting anywhere. You're not
Right.
bumping your wellness or happiness. In fact, you're undermining it.
Right. Oh, yeah, it's a lot. And I think a lot of these kids in, again, for sure at the high school level, if not even earlier,
Yeah.
are sort of already starting to feel just that intense pressure. And it's one thing to say the words like, we don't care where you go to school, you're going to be fine, but to also kind of work backwards, even when they're really little. And what kind of
Yeah.
questions are you asking when they come home from school? Like, I remember we talked to preschool teachers about what kind of questions can parents ask? And they can say, what kind thing did you do for someone else today?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
ask about, again, the spelling test grade or just anything, again, more outcome oriented.
And there's so subtle ways that we do this. You can wherever you go to school is okay. But did you know that your cousin Jake got into Harvard? Isn't that amazing? Right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what an accomplishment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, um, you know, what do we, do we keep the tests where they got an A on
Right. Put it
the
on the
on
refrigerator
the
with a magnet.
refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
It's like there's all sorts of these subtle ways.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing is that as much as we try, it's not just parents. It's
Right.
schools are involved in this. Schools keep track of who goes to these highly
Hmm.
selective schools,
Hmm.
right? These highly selective colleges.
Yep.
Kids are a part of this as well, and so we can't address this in a vacuum. As we can do
Hmm.
everything we can as parents, but we're all breathing the same air and drinking the same water, and
Hmm.
in so many ways, it's putting pressure on our kids that's making them less resilient,
Right.
undermining their wellness, instead of what we really believe we're doing is
Right.
giving them the jump start and the foundation to launch into a life of wellness.
Right. And we know, of course, right? We know, especially there's been an incredibly uh, popular and wonderful book called The Anxious Generation, written
Yeah,
by Jonathan Haidt. We know that one of the most important things we can do for our kids' mental health is to basically allow them to develop resilience, right?
yeah,
And to stop bubble wrapping our kids and to allow them to develop distress tolerance skills.
yeah.
And yet, right, like it sounds like what we're sort of doing by creating these narrow ways of thinking about success and overstructuring our kids and it's undermining their ability to develop these skills. Can you tell us a little bit as parents? Because I want to kind of switch now into the what can we do section, because I think
Yeah. Yeah.
parents really, and educators too, who might be listening, really want to know what they can start to do now to help with this problem. Tell us a little bit about what you think we can do to help kids develop this resilience.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. I think that just to go back to the problem first, and then
Yes,
we'll step into the
absolutely.
solutions. I think that in so many ways, it's about us doing less, not more, as parents.
Mhm.
There's compared to the 1970s when I was growing up, there were more double income families.
Yes.
So we've got parents who are working harder than they've ever worked before. Interestingly, they're also spending more time as parents than we've ever spent before. And so even though we're spending more time at work and we're also spending more time parenting, I think kids are getting 40 hours more parenting than they did in the 1970s. And so I think that this has a couple of different things that happens in the 1990s. There was a whole theory, and an important theory, about self-esteem, that if we want our kids to be well, then they need to have self-esteem. Unfortunately, I think the way as a society we've misunderstood that, and we've tried to hack it, and I like you use the word distress tolerance. What happens, I think, the way we've understood that, and the way, at least the way we've acted on that research, is to say, if our kids are distressed, then that undermines their self-esteem. And so we need to keep them from experiencing distress in order to continue to boost their self-esteem. When in fact, the opposite is true. It's essential that our kids experience distress.
Right.
And by experiencing distress, that's the only way they can learn how to deal with it. But what
Right.
happens is, as parents, because we're so much more involved in their lives,
Yeah.
I shared a graph. I'd never heard of a play date until I became a parent, and I'm like, what is a play date? Because we didn't have those when I was a
Right.
kid.
Kids would just roam the neighborhood and come back for dinner time.
Exactly. But now as adults, we're structuring their time together. And the good news is we can teach them a lot of social skills and other things as we're doing that. The bad news is that they aren't learning these things
Right.
themselves.
Right.
And so I like the anxious generation, especially the part about our overparenting of kids, our inability to tolerate their distress. I think
Mhm.
sometimes we experience when our kids are distressed that we've done something wrong, when in fact this is that what we know is the only way to learn how to deal with stress is to experience it. Um, and so in so many ways, a lot of this is doing less, not more. When our kids are having are having a conflict with a teacher, um, talking that through. I can't remember who it was. Wendy, I can't remember her last name. She wrote a book called The Blessings of a B
Oh, yes,
B
of a skin
plus.
knee. Yes.
Um, and and Blessings of a Skin Knee, right? And what she talks about is the best thing that could happen for our kids is that they have a really hard fourth grade teacher because that's how they're going to learn
Yep.
how to do
They're
this.
gonna have a hard boss one day, a difficult
Exactly.
coworker.
They're gonna struggle with other teachers in the future. But I think what we end up doing as parents is to try and change the teacher
Yes.
instead of be able to say, as long as it's not toxic,
Correct.
right? And Lisa D'Amour talks about this. Is it intolerable or is it uncomfortable?
Yep. Yep.
And so what we want kids to do is to experience discomfort and not rescue them from it, not jump in and try and tell them what to do and how to cope with it.
Yep.
But also it's important that we're present with them and being
Right.
able to just be present and say, this sounds really hard.
Right. You want to empathize with your child's
Yeah,
emotional experience for sure and sit with them in it, but not save them from it.
not save them from
Um,
it.
I know for me as a parent, I have two girls, and I know it's been very reassuring whenever something happens that's not perfect, which is
Yeah,
life, right? Any
right.
disappointment, anything like that, just for me to say to myself internally, okay, it's a challenge, right? And
Yeah,
from this challenge, they're going to grow in some way. They're going to develop a life skill, which they will need. And so,
yes,
as opposed to just feeling horrible for them and being kind of like just too drowned out by that emotion, because you're
yeah,
empathic as a parent, it's
yeah.
like you want to have some empathy, of course, and also to understand that you can't save them and that this is actually going to help them in the scheme of their life.
Right. But we've got to step back and be able to see that picture. And
Yes.
one of the things that I think worries us as parents is I think that we take what's happening in this moment and we very quickly fast forward 10 to 15 years. And if my child doesn't care that they got a B minus on a test, then how are they ever going to keep a job that they like, right? How are they ever going to make it in college if I'm not on top of them? And so
Mhm.
we have we fast forward, and what we know is that there's so much that changes in this time, and that it's not an indication. If my child lies to me when they are 5 years old, doesn't mean they're going to be a serial liar, right? And they'll never take responsibility.
Right.
Um, but it's easy for us to feel that and believe that, and
Yes.
then over involve ourselves to try and correct it.
If we
When in
over
fact,
worry, we over problem solve.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. And
You
so,
you told a story, Doug, in your book about, I think it was about your son, Matthew, maybe,
yeah,
and how he was, late to one of his internships. Can you kind of tell that
yeah,
story? Because I think it's a really good one to illustrate, that these skills do develop over time.
right. Well, the funny thing is that I was that parent who was like, oh my gosh. Yeah, so he was working as an inclusion aide at a camp, and he got the job as a sophomore, and I was so proud of him, and he's so good with people. And so he got the job and he showed up 15 minutes late every day. And it drove me nuts. And I think it drove folks at the camp nuts, right? And I knew the director, and they're like, yeah, he's great, but he shows up late every day. And so I talked to him. I'm like, why don't you just leave 15 minutes early? Well, the thing is that he knew how to tell time, but being able to be aware of time is developmental, and it takes a while to be able to think, to notice time is elapsing, right? To be able to plan ahead and know, oh, this is how much time I've been spending doing this. So I think, we could ask him to leave early, but I don't think he kept track of time very well. You could put 5 watches on his arms and a clock on every wall, and he just wouldn't think to check it, right?
Mhm.
That's just where he was at as a sophomore. Of course, his sister, she was always on time. She was always like, it was, everything was like clockwork.
Right.
So he ends up being late and defensive whenever I would talk to him about it. How's he going to hold down a job later? Like all these, and so then the next summer he got the job again, thankfully,
Mhm.
and he used to run around barefoot all the time, and he'd ride his bike to work, and so he'd show up on his bike but without shoes about two days a week. So then they'd have to send him home
Oh
because he
my
needs shoes to be right.
So
And
funny.
but he was there on time every day. He just forgot his shoes. And
Right.
then by the time he was a senior, he was counselor of the year, right?
Mhm.
Showing up on time with his shoes. But it's almost like you're watching
The
that
development.
brain slowly start to click together.
Right.
And just because it was slower for him didn't mean it wasn't going to happen. And I think that's it. I've got a friend, his name is Dave Gleason, and he wrote a great book, um, At What Cost? Defending children's development in highly competitive schools, right?
Mm.
And he developed this term called developmental empathy, which means what we want to do is we want to match what we're asking kids to do with their brain's development. Because whenever we ask them to do something that they can't handle, that's what creates stress.
Right.
And I think that's what's happening for a lot of kids is as we've increased the demands that we're placing on kids and this idea that academic rigor is better,
Yeah.
some kids are able to keep up with that, but those kids then are on that hedonic treadmill that we worry about. And the
Right.
kids who can't keep up are at risk of feeling extreme levels of shame.
Right.
And what we also know is that this push for academic achievement, this push for rigor, has not helped us in the world standings of it has not improved kids' ability to learn.
Right.
But I think we get anxious that all of a sudden we're falling behind as a nation, as a school
Right.
district, as a classroom, as a student.
Yeah.
And then we put on all this pressure to achieve more and to increase rigor. I want rigor to happen for kids, but it's because their brains are ready and they're
Right.
curious and they're engaged, that
And
rigor is
then
about
and then it's a
engagement.
match for their skill set and their
Exactly.
ability. And I think about that in terms of the high schools, gives the middle school recommendations of what classes they should be in. And
Yeah,
every year, parents write angry emails and they want to opt up, not when they're given a choice, but really like they just want to say, nope, he's going to do this anyway. And
that's
they're
right.
very
Because
thoughtful about how they respond and just sort of guiding the parents to say, do you want him to be, really not only working really hard, but also not feeling good about the outcome,
yeah,
because it's not a match. And it'd be so nice if parents could just relax a little bit and have confidence that whether they're in the high this class or not, they're going to find what they're good at and hopefully enjoy learning and work hard and be able to do well in what they like, which
yeah,
isn't always, like you said, obvious in high school or even in college.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That in an engaged brain is way better than a stressed brain.
Yes.
And that they're going to learn more. I think I shared this at the Catch event, but there's a guy who tweeted out, he said, I got a 2.1 my first semester in physics, and I thought I wasn't meant for the sciences. And he said, and this week I landed the rover on Mars, and I'm creating a new one for Venus or something like that, right? Or Saturn, wherever they're going next.
Amazing.
And he said, I never would have imagined that this is where I would be. And what we know is that his grades weren't important. His engagement was. And uh, and um and so that's a mistake I think we can often make. And what I would want for my kids is that they're engaged and curious. That
Yes,
that's what drives learning, and that's what drives development. Not are they getting A's and B's in the hardest classes we can put them in. Not are
absolutely.
they on the track for an Ivy League school. Um,
Absolutely.
that doesn't these things don't pay off in the ways that we believe they will, and in fact, more often than not, they undermine our kids' ability to feel successful and healthy and well.
Absolutely. So this next question kind of weaves your book in a little bit too,
Yeah.
again, untethered. Um, what would you say for, again, both parents and educators is an important ingredient to helping kids achieve wellness, right? Happiness, wellness. Um, things that parents can do and educators can do in whether it's at home or in the classroom.
So the first thing that comes to mind, one of the things I loved about writing Untethered was I include a lot of student stories.
Mhm.
And there's so many, and that's what I loved about the work, was that there were so many kids who seemed to be in crisis. They not only were they struggling, academically, but they were told they needed to go to an entirely different school in
Yeah.
order to meet their emotional and behavioral needs, and they were way off of outside of the path that we often see as the path towards success. And it was amazing to watch these students come back after they graduated and come back with their families and come back and talk about how much they enjoyed college, talk about how much they talk about their families,
Mhm.
um, talk about how important a sense of belonging was that they experienced at North Shore Academy, and that was the difference maker. That
Mhm.
at North Shore Academy, we did not have, we were not academically rigorous, and
Mhm.
yet we had students going on to get their PhDs later on.
Mm.
It's not the content that matters. What matters is our ability to create the communities where kids can thrive. And so I guess that's what my book is about. That's what my work at North Shore Academy was about, is about how can we embed our kids in communities that are first and foremost emotionally connected,
Mhm.
and focus on emotional regulation, our ability to manage the stresses without becoming stressed. Because what happens in so many families when kids struggle, as a as adults, we then get dysregulated. We become anxious, and then we become so focused on their success. We may be more likely to yell at them, say things to them that are hurtful. Why is it that you can't do it when your sister can do it? Your sister was able to do it. Why
Right.
is it you can't play baseball if you haven't finished this assignment? Whatever it may be, we become reactive in those moments. And so what we want to do is, my hope is that we can have schools that focus first and foremost on belonging,
Mhm.
and emotional regulation, so
Mhm.
that we can, because what we know is that this is what brings our brains alive, is being connected to other people
Mhm.
and being emotionally regulated. Then we can learn, then we can
Right.
fully engage. And so the more we can create those communities for our kids, the
Mhm.
more we can embed those our kids in those communities, the better.
You talk in the book too about being less punitive and not, just kind of being behaviorist and how we manage
Yeah.
the unpleasant behaviors that some of the kids present with, but really kind of looking at it more from an attachment lens and a
Yeah.
connection. Can you give a maybe one? I know we're running out of time, but maybe
Yeah.
one case example of a kiddo who is struggling in your time as at the academy and kind of what you saw kind of shape, the outcome differently?
Yeah, I'll tell the story of my son Matthew.
Thank you.
So Matthew was, everything came easy to him in elementary and the first part of middle school. But then, all of a sudden, I like to say I could smell, I could sniff something was wrong, right? And there it was his eighth grade year. Um, I woke up in the middle of the night smelling something burning. And I ran downstairs, and there was Matthew at 3 in the morning pulling out paper from from the oven, trying to make it look like a historical document, kind of browning the edges and everything. And he had a project for weeks we didn't know about, and he was just starting it the night before it was due. It was the first of many all-nighters
Mm.
that he would feel the need to pull. But what happened was he felt shame. He struggled to organize himself because his all those executive functioning skills were just slower to develop. It's not that they didn't develop; they were
Right.
slower to develop, and so it was harder for him to plan things. And so he'd show up as a freshman and sophomore. He'd become anxious if he didn't get the work done, and it was really hard for him to get the work done on time and in the way. So he'd either scribble it in the hallway right before he went in and go in late, or he would skip class altogether because he wasn't prepared. He felt
Mm.
ashamed of going to class without his assignment done. Well, what happens in schools is, we punish that behavior to try and get it to work better. The thing about punishments and incentives, those have been debunked for decades. 70 years we've known that these things don't work, and the research is just about, and yet this is still our go-to strategy, is to punish when things don't go wrong instead of seeing it as an issue of development. So, when you are late for class or you don't show up at class, you get detentions.
Mm.
And so I'll ask people, like, how many times would you need to give a detention before you realize that it wasn't working? Because it didn't work for Matthew. It
It's
doesn't
not changing his behavior, right?
exactly. It doesn't change his behavior
Oh,
because the issue is not compliance. The
right.
issue is that his executive functioning skills aren't developed enough.
Mm.
And so he ended up senior year, he's about to graduate. And he comes to me and he says, Dad, I achieved something I didn't think I was ever going to achieve. And I said, I'm thinking National Honor Society. I'm like, you're speaking at graduation. What is it? And he says, I hit 500. And I'm like, 500 what? He says, I got 500 detentions.
Oh my God.
In his high school career, he got 500 detentions.
Oh,
If detention worked, it's
right.
interesting. We take a look at the recidivism rate for people following release from state prisons. And it's amazing that 3/4 end up reoffending.
Oh,
It's because we're trying to solve the wrong problem. It's not an issue of motivation for Matthew. Punishments and incentives work when kids are unmotivated,
right.
but it's almost never an issue of motivation. It's
Right.
almost always an issue of development.
Right.
So all of a sudden we pile shame on to these issues that they're already feeling shame about.
Right.
And so all of a sudden he's having to
Mm.
attend detentions
Jeez.
for every day he'd have a lunch detention instead of being with his friends, which would
Right. Which doesn't
probably
help
make
with
it more
connection and
likely.
belonging and feeling
Exactly.
loved and all of that. Oh my goodness.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just so wonderful to get to talk to you about all of your ideas. I hope that everyone listening will either read or, as I did, listen on Audible. I loved that it was your voice. That was really cool.
Yeah,
Um,
it was fun to do. Yeah.
really cool to his book Untethered. And my last question is just if you have any favorite resources for us, whether they be podcasts or books, anything to help parents kind of learn more about this topic. I guess we kind of covered two topics, but both,
Yeah.
the topic that you speak about more in your book, as well as just the idea of helping kids to kind of decrease the pressure they're feeling about attending these elitist college and being the first violin and so forth.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I love Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson's book, The Power of Showing Up. I think it's a quick read
Yeah.
actually, but filled with all sorts of ways you know, of you were saying earlier, what are some things we can do? And I think it's filled with ideas of ways that we can approach parenting,
Hmm.
about how we can show up as opposed to how can we continue to push our kids in ways that may be undermining for them. And so I guess I would
Yeah.
start with that book now that I as
Is that the same author who did, I know Dan Siegel is, but
yeah,
is that other author the same one who did Parenting from the Inside Out?
yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
was an amazing, very
Yeah.
like user-friendly, hands-on kind of book with ideas for parents to use right away too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And any other podcasts or any other things you recommend?
It's a Well, I love the Hidden Brain podcast. So
Okay.
that's one of
I
the
love
ones that
it.
I often listen to. It's not so much for kids and parenting. Um, and this podcast.
Thank you, of course. And also your website. I was going to say, tell us the name of your website.
Oh, it's drddougbolton.com.
Okay. I thought it was pretty easy. Is it DR?
Yeah, drddougbolton.com.
Perfect. We will put that also
Thank you so
in the
much.
transcript. No, of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Bolton, for everything. Please check out Dr. Bolton's book, Untethered, and everyone check out more episodes of our podcast. Please go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And as always, thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Bolton, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been what a great conversation. I'm so grateful for your questions and the spirit and wisdom you've brought to this conversation. So
Thank you.
you.
Likewise.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.